thinking. And so, yeah, so let's just do a couple minutes, a few minutes. So we can bring our attention to the present moment sensations of the in breath, the out breath. You notice the feeling of the air coming in and out of your nose and mouth, the movement of your ribs or abdomen. And when thoughts or emotions arise, you just notice them. But don't follow. We don't follow them, and we don't reject them. We just notice them and gently bring our attention back to the breath. And while we're still in a meditative mode, keep going, but we'll shift our attention away from the breath. And let's just do a brief meditation together on compassion, on cultivating compassion in the present moment, and also as our motivation for class and for today. Let's start with self-compassion. So, first we'll cultivate the thought, right? May I, that's the self, right? May I be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. And you can think that thought generally, right? May I be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. And you can also think of specific sufferings, generating compassion for yourself, the suffering in the mind, suffering of the body, and so on. And as we think that towards ourselves, let's imagine kind of energy or light of compassion in our heart, gradually, I guess like the feeling actually, right? That feeling of compassion as an energy coming from our heart and filling our bodies and surrounding ourselves first. So we're cultivating a kind of feeling of compassion, visual image of light energy, and those thoughts. Right? May I be free of suffering, of the causes of suffering. Especially of the inner causes of suffering in our own being. May I be free from those. May I be free of the deepest causes of suffering, the deep causes of samsara. As you continue to include yourself, we'll expand our compassion outward. So the next step is to include people or animals close to you, those close to you. So it could be your friends, family, pets. You think, like, may they also be free of suffering and of the causes of suffering. You can so you think, may they also be free of suffering and the causes of suffering. And you can bring to mind like particular people close to you or animals close to you, cultivating a feeling of compassion for them. You can think of like their face or their body or their being, and of specific sufferings they may be going through. And then also the deep causes of suffering within their being. May they be free of suffering and its causes. You can imagine that feeling and that light energy reaching from your heart to them, right, which is, your compassion, right? You're visualizing your compassion reaching out to them. The compassion surrounds them, fills them up. You can even imagine it eases or frees them from their suffering. May they also be free of suffering and the causes of suffering. You can just take a moment to think of a few, or however many you want, but specific individuals you care about, who you naturally feel love for. May they be free of suffering and its causes. And feel that energy from your heart flowing to them. May we be free of suffering and the causes of suffering. All of us. And then next step is we expand that us or that we to also strangers. Think first like of your neighbors, people who live in your community. May they be free of suffering and of the causes of suffering. And you can imagine that energy from your heart, which is compassion, the nature of compassion, flowing out to your community, your neighborhood or your town, county. May they be free of suffering and the causes of suffering. May we all be free of suffering and of its superficial causes and of its deep causes. Stay with the people we don't know or strangers, or you can we'll take a couple minutes, just expand that out as much as you want to, so wherever you're called, right? You can think of people who are going through particular sufferings of illness in the hospital, or people who are going through like, the sufferings of old age, suffering of sickness, people in hospice, or like the suffering of death. People in regions where there's war, people in places where there's extreme political, social oppression. There are endless kinds of suffering. So just like, may they be free of suffering and the causes of suffering. Whichever comes to mind, whichever kinds of suffering come to mind, right? We cultivate that kind of wish. May they be free of suffering and the causes of suffering. May we all be free of suffering, right? Its superficial causes and its deep causes. And as we continue, let's take a couple minutes now also to include, whether it be in your personal life or in the broader world, bring to mind people you tend to dislike or feel aversion for. So as I say, your enemies, people you find aversive, whatever. And we cultivate the thought, right? May they also be free of suffering and of the causes of suffering. You can imagine that light energy also reaching them, taking away suffering and its causes. Again, like we did with the loved ones, you can briefly, bring to mind the faces or bodies of beings who you tend to feel averse for. May they be free also of suffering and its causes. And actually, if you imagine them being freed of suffering and its causes, then if they're no longer suffering, then actually there's nothing to whatever you previously would have disliked or found aversive. Is no longer relevant. But may we all be free of suffering and the cause of suffering. The final phase of this meditation, we'll just one last part is we think, may all beings, may all sentient beings be free of suffering and the causes of suffering. You can imagine like the energy or light of compassion going out in all directions. It's the universe, embracing all beings. May I and all sentient beings be free of suffering and its causes. Purpose of my life or my existence is actually that, is to free myself and all beings from suffering and its causes. May I be able to free myself and others, all others, from the suffering and its causes. May I achieve full enlightenment in order of Buddhahood in order to be able to accomplish free myself and all others from suffering and its causes. I'll conclude the meditation just with a quick recitation of the verse of refuge in Bodhicitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. No, jump. So I guess I'll say a few things, then we can have some discussion or whatever. And there's Gloria suggested talking some about karma, which is a good topic. And I was like sort of pausing. Last night I was thinking about it. I was like, oh, they're infinite, and karma. Just the topic of karma is huge. So it's like, there's a lot that could be talked about. But there are at least a few points that seem important to start with. And I'll start where I wasn't thinking to start. Actually, one point I was thinking about last night is that when Gyumei Khyentse Rinpoche was on the East Coast last year, he kept, everywhere he went, I followed around. Everywhere he went, he kept teaching on this one verse from Lama Tsongkhapa. And the verse was essentially, it was a verse from a poem, but it basically, the line that he kept teaching was, it said, it used these Tibetan words. It said sem sangpo. So sem is mind or heart, sometimes translated. And sangpo is like good, right? So like, if you have the good heart or good mind was the first line. And so it said, if you have a good heart, or the good heart, or if you have a good mind, then it said that your path, like lam, right? Like lamrim, your path and your sa is like ground or place, sometimes you can say. So that if you have a good mind or a good heart, then your path and your place will be good. And then in the next, and there was just two lines. Then the next line was, if you don't have a good heart, if you don't have a good mind, then your path and your place will be no good, will not be good. So it's just that, very simple in one way, right? Very simple point. But I was thinking about it, I thought, oh, that's actually the essence of Dharma practice, and it's a teaching on karma. Right? So if your heart is good, your path will be good, and your place will be good. If your heart is not good, then your path will not be good, and your place, the ground will not be good. And there are many, there are many layers or levels in which you could interpret that simple two lines. But to put it simply, it's like this actually with karma, regarding karma, right? Which is one way of explaining that verse. Actually, a main way of explaining it is sometimes we say, right, the Sanskrit word karma is translated as action, right? Your acts, but the main action is your mind. There is the mind is the source of all action, right? We know that actually everything you do, right? Your physical and verbal behavior come from your mind. And what this verse from Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, basically, right, is if your mind is in a good place, right, then whatever you do will be good. Your actions will be virtuous, in other words. If your mind is in a negative state, right, then your actions will be non-virtuous, will lead to suffering. And in one way, that seems very simple, right? But then, actually, if you think deeply about it, well, actually, first of all, what does that even mean? Actually, right? Like, if you actually start to analyze, well, what does it mean to have a good mind or a good heart? Right? I always try to translate that carefully or talk about it carefully, because when I say, sometimes I hesitate. Sometimes they usually translate sem as mind, sometimes heart, though. And the reason why it's both is sometimes mind in English, we can sometimes have the connotation it's just intellectual, right? Like, thinking versus your heart, like Thomas Jefferson wrote that famous, right, letter with a discussion between his head and his heart, as if they're two separate things, right? But in the Buddhist context, they're not separate. So sem is both. What we usually would say either, but either of those terms, the way we think of it, sem would encompass them. So what does it mean to have a good mind or a good heart, or to not have a good mind or a good heart, right? Because part of it is like that. That's what I wanted to sort of get into today. In a way, is there are different layers or levels on which one can talk about karma, right? And they're all useful, But let's see it the right way. I sometimes think of it like moral development, actually. Like for sometimes, and actually, it's easy to think of it in terms of other people, but for each of us, sometimes need like there are teachings in like the teaching on the 10 virtues and the 10 non-virtues, which some of you may have heard, right? Similar to don't kill, don't steal, and so on. And sometimes they'll emphasize, which is correct, that the karma of killing or stealing leads you to suffer in the future. The karma of restraining from harming others leads to good things in the future. Which is, according to Buddhism, is true. But it's actually interesting, isn't it? If you think of it from a moral development perspective, right? So don't do bad things because you'll suffer, is useful. But it's actually not a very advanced level of moral development, is it? In other words, I won't hurt you because it might hurt myself. That's good. It's good not to hurt somebody because it might hurt myself. But what this teaching that Khenpo Rinpoche was sharing is getting at is a higher, I think, is a deeper level of moral development, right? What he's getting at is watch your own mind moment to moment, right? And what does it mean to have a good mind or a good heart? That's a deeper question, I think, in terms of self-awareness. And I was going to share like that quote, right, I just shared was from Lama Tsongkhapa. There's a similar, different, but a similar point made by, I was going to share it just because I thought it was intriguing and gets at a similar issue, which then we'll keep going with. But Jigten Sumgun, who's the Kagyu Lama, who's the founder of the Drikung Kagyu lineage, he had a quote which said, the karmic cause and effect is the natural manifestation of one's own moment-to-moment thoughts. So there he's getting at something similar to what Lama Tsongkhapa is getting at, which is if you really want to understand and guard or work with your karma, you have to understand what's happening in your own mind moment to moment, right? And maybe I'll use that to now. I'm going to share something about karma from the perspective of I'll just jump to they get at this in the Lamrim, first of all, where they talk about for a complete karmic action, there have to be various factors. But there are three factors that have to happen in your mind, they say. One is you have to have a discrimination, which is omnipresent. It's always present. So, you have to, when you do something, an action, you're sort of discerning something, right? You're seeing, if you're going to be generous, you see something you're going to give, for example. If you're going to steal, you see something you're going to steal, right? Then there's then there's a motivation, right? And the motivation often includes a mental affliction, or sometimes includes a virtuous state of mind. And then there has to be intention or motivation. It becomes a motivation. Intention is more basic than motivation. And I wanted to get at intention for a moment, because I think it'll help us understand this. So I'm going today, I said the deep psychology of karma, right? So I'm not going to, I don't want to, I mean, other people have probably talked about the other topics, but I want to go into this topic of the psychology related to karma. And so in Buddhist psychology, in the Buddhist psychological, and what is intent? And sometimes I think a better translation sometimes is mental impulse, mental impulses. And so what is that? And what they say actually is that's what moves your mind towards something, right? So it's how your mind engages with anything. If you read a quote, right? It has the function of engaging the mind, is one point from the Abhidharma. The Abhidharma teachings say that. The reason why I'm not so sure about the translation of intention is that intention, this mental factor, which I would call it mental impulse, doesn't have to be intentional. It can be unconscious. And so it's this like, and I was going to read one more quote that I think will help get at it, and then I'll talk about it. It says, this factor of mental impulse, this is an actual Buddhist text I'm reading here, a text by Kachin Yeshi Gyaltsen. But it says, just as iron is helplessly drawn by a magnet, the mind helplessly engages an object due to this mental factor. So, and actually, so you have to look inside yourself now, right? And do you see how that happens? In other words, as you, like when you wake up in the morning and you open your eyes, right? Without choice, your mind starts to engage something, right? And sometimes you see something, right? And then your mind engages with that in a certain way. Sometimes you hear something, like actually, if you heard something first thing in the morning, right? What would happen? Like, let's say you're asleep and you hear it, and suddenly there's a very loud noise, right? Without choice, your mind would engage that. And depending upon your disposition, you might think, oh, why is somebody making a loud noise? Or you might think, oh, how wonderful. I hear somebody happily playing or stuff. I don't know, you might be happy or you might be upset, but your mind would engage with that object, right? That's intent. That's this mental impulse that engages the mind. And it can engage with things that you see, things that you hear, things that you smell, things you taste, or with thoughts, right? With mental objects. And why am I talking about this, what I'm going to call mental impulse? Because according to Buddhism, that's karma. From a deep psychological, the more kind of, Buddhist psychological teachings, that mental impulse that engages the mind with objects is karma, actually. So karma is mainly mental, right? And what they're getting at, and then they say, if it's just a mental action, then that's sufficient. Sometimes our actions become verbal or physical, but they happen because the mind is engaging with something. So there is this mental impulse towards engagement is the process of, it is karma itself, actually, is one quote. And so it's an impulse that directs the mind towards something, right? And that process of our mind having an impulse to engage with something, that's what karma actually is, according to Buddhism. And then that gets expressed in all different ways, right? So this mental factor of the mind engaging with things is neutral in and of itself. It's not morally, so it's not virtuous, it's not non-virtuous, it's not anything. It's not, it has no, its nature is not intrinsically, or from its own side, virtuous or not virtuous. So go back to Kent Rinpoche's quote. So what does it mean to have a good heart or not a good heart? Right? So that means actually that this factor of intention or mental impulse, according to Buddhism, is connected at any given moment with either I'll call them virtuous states of mind or non-virtuous states of mind or neutral states of mind. Right? This is the psychology. So I'm getting into the psychology now behind karma. And what they're actually saying, and I'll go back to my example, right? So if I were asleep, right, and then suddenly a loud noise woke me up, right? Like I said, without any choice, my mental impulse would go towards so I would engage with that sound, right? My mind would engage with the sound. I might think, what is that, as I'm waking up? And I gave two different examples. I gave them because let's use them because they get at this point, right? On the one hand, if I thought, let's say it was a loud, I don't know, let's say it was like somebody with a loud car who was like revving it outside early in the morning outside the window or something, right? And so one example, I'm going to give an example of anger, right? So then I thought, oh, what a jerk. They woke me up early in the morning because they're revving their car with no muffler. Why are they doing that? Right? That's karma, right? And that's karma connected to anger or hate or something, different translations of this term, right? And so going back to the quote from Lama Tsongkhapa, right? What he's saying there is, if you don't have the good heart, then your path will be bad, won't be good, and your place won't be good. Actually, it's kind of funny in a way, right? Because I always think this actually. Actually, as soon as you wake up, if that's your thought, already your place is not good, right? You feel actually, you can think about it in terms of the future, which is what is usually intended there, but it's already true in the present, right? As soon as you feel angry at your neighbor, I'm giving you a fictional example here, but you can make up your own, right? Already your place, right, your home is not appearing as a good place. It's appearing as a very unpleasant place, right? And your mind is not in a good place, right? You're agitated. And, in that moment, you're not seeing your neighbor as they see themselves. You're seeing them according to your own, actually, right? Self-referenced attitude, in reference to your wishes, right? And your mind, the nature of anger is your mind, the nature of anger, according to Buddhism, one is it's an agitated state of mind that exaggerates the negative qualities, right, of its object. And so that's what this, whether you're thinking of Jigten Sumgön's quote, right? Karma, cause and effect, is the natural manifestation of one's own moment-to-moment thoughts, or quote from Lama Tsongkhapa, right? If you have a good heart, then your path and your ground will be good. If you don't have a good heart, your path and your ground won't be good. It's getting at this kind of moment, right? Every moment. In other words, it's getting at every single moment of our lives. So in my fictional example, right, the noise, right? So what they're saying then, what Buddhism is saying is, your intention or your mental impulse is connected to anger in that moment. So your karma is negative, right? Why is it negative? Because it's agitated and distorted. This is not somebody else doing a moral judgment. That's an important point too, right? This isn't somebody else doing a moral judgment of you. It's not the Buddha telling you you're wrong. What it's saying actually is your mind is agitated, right? and by nature, when we're angry, we distort, right? We see things in a more distorted way than we usually do. And that becomes a habit, right? And actually science says that too, by the way, right? Any emotional state you cultivate becomes more habitual. How do they say it? Anyway, if there are different ways to put that, but you habituate your mind essentially to that kind of state. And that's suffering. And it's a cause of future suffering. And the karmic result of that will only be suffering. So that's when it says your path will not be good. Again, it's not like wishing you to have a bad path. It's just saying if that's in a moment like that, you're creating a bad path for yourself, right? And then your place is already not so good, and it's creating a karmic tendency or karmic seed, they would say, for a bad result, for further bad experiences. And it's strange, and go back to and now I'm going to go back to that example, right? Like, on the other hand, right? I'm just making up fictional examples here, right? But on the other hand, the same sound, right? A loud car in the morning. Say, make a fictional example here. Say a mother's been waiting for her child to return, right? And the weather was bad, and they are having to come, and the mother fell asleep, waiting for her child, and she's woken up by the sound of a loud car outside, very early in the morning, and she realizes her child made it home safely. They have a bad muffler, right? She would feel overjoyed maybe at that same sound, right? Oh, thank goodness they're here safe. She would wake up from her sleep and immediately feel incredible joy, right? Like that her child made it safely through the night despite the ice or something. Same sound, right? But the point is, here's the point, is like, it's love, right? In other words, I'm using a fictional example here, but the point I'm getting at is that mother, the first thing when she would wake up, she'd be feeling love. Like, she has I'm making up a story, but she has a protective impulse towards her child. And then she knows the child's safe. Absolutely, it's an adult child, obviously, they're driving. But she would feel overjoyed at that sound, right? That they're home safely and that they didn't get harmed, and that now she gets to see them because she loves them, right? So that's an example of, right, if your mind is good, or your heart is good, then your path is good and your place is good, right? But the external sound is the same in both of those examples I just gave, right? And so part of what I'm getting at is we think wrongly, according to Buddhism, that it's external things, that external objects are the cause. And what this point is saying is, right? That no, it's your good heart that's the cause, right? It's your love. In my example, love versus anger. That's the example I gave here. You could pick other mental afflictions versus positive states of mind. And what Buddhism is saying, going back to this mental factor of mental impulse, I'm going to call it, right? The mental impulse towards an object, like a magnet, it said, right? Like iron and a magnet, is if that mental impulse is associated with a virtue, with a virtuous mind like love, then your karma is virtuous. Your karma is positive. And according to Buddhism, positive karma can only lead to positive results. And negative karma can only lead to negative results. That's like a causal process. When they say karmic cause and effect, that's what Buddhism's saying, is that and what it's getting at, though, is this really, is that if in a given moment, I'm just using an example now, if in a given moment, if you have them, I'll call it a mental factor or mental quality of love present, then your mental impulse towards an object will be positive, and the result will be positive. and so on. And if it's hatred, for example, then it'll be negative. And so what this is getting at, so again, I'm going back. So on the one hand, on the most basic level of Buddhism, right? If you start with the most basic teaching, which is actually quite useful, there's if somebody's going out murdering people, good enough that they stop murdering to start with, or something like that, right? In other words, we need to start with the most basic things. But you can see this is getting at a deeper point, right? For training ourselves, which is here, what you're actually doing when you're practicing these kind of teachings that, like the one Kent Rinpoche was teaching last year, what you're actually trying to do then is notice your mind moment to moment, right? And actually it becomes interesting then, isn't it? Is can you cultivate? It becomes an interesting question. Can you cultivate? First of all, you can. Buddhism saying it's possible, but I mean, in theory, but now as an individual, can I? Is the question. How can I cultivate virtue in a moment-to-moment way, right? Which means a virtuous mind, a loving mind. And actually, I'll share some reflections. I was thinking about this, and actually this morning as I was making breakfast, I was thinking about this. And I thought, actually, like, I didn't understand it deeply. I didn't understand it completely at the time. I understood it intuitively. But actually, I was thinking about my grandmother. Yeah. Anyway, I was thinking about, she's long since passed away. But I was thinking of her, and I thought, oh, she gave me a very profound teaching on karma, although she wasn't Buddhist. Because I remember she liked to cook, and she would say, I always cook with love. She said, that's the secret, as she was dying, she was giving me advice about cooking in a very loving way. And what I'm getting at here is, like, I just want to challenge you to think about something. Can you actually be in a state of love the whole time you're cooking a meal? That's a profound teaching on karma, right? It's one thing to say, I love my family, so I'm going to go cook for them, for example. But that's not what this is getting at, right? That's words, actually, right? Oh, I love my family, so I'm going to go cook for them. Those are words. But what this teaching is getting at is, right, the movement of your mind. So as you're reaching for the spatula, is there love in your mind, right? Because that mind that engages the spatula is karma, right? That's everyday life. That's moment to moment, right? But is there love in your mind in that moment or not? I'm just giving an example, right? And, like, what an amazing meditation practice it would be, right? If you could cook a one whole meal without losing love as a present moment experience throughout the entire meal of cooking that one meal, that would be an amazing meditation, right? That's Buddhist meditation, actually. You don't need to be sitting like in meditation posture to meditate. Because meditation is defined as a familiarizing gom, right? It's meditation, familiarizing the mind with virtue. So love is a virtue, right? Loving kindness. So I'm just pointing out, this is karma, right? So if you cook an entire meal the whole time cultivating love, then that would be an amazing positive karma, right? But actually, do you watch your mind? This is what this teaching is getting at, right? Like, because let's say you think, like, many times it's like this, right? You think, oh yeah, like, actually, sometimes people don't even think anything. They just think, oh, I have to cook. Shoot, I don't feel like it, right? And I go cook. Okay, well, that's actually, if they're annoyed, then it becomes a non-virtuous, right? Annoyance is a kind of non-virtuous experience. So then you'd be actually doing a non-virtue, right? Sometimes it's neutral, right? Where you're just sort of distracted, not thinking anything. Or sometimes while you're cooking, you're thinking about something, right? Like, so if you think about somebody you saw and then you cultivate whatever, anger at them or craving for them or something, right? Then your mind is engaging with the spatula or the knife or the vegetable or whatever, right? But your overall mental, is there a virtuous state of mind? Going back to Kent Rinpoche, right? Is the heart good or is the heart not good, right? So if let's say you're thinking about somebody at work and you're annoyed at them while you're cooking, right? Then you don't have a good heart, right? And so then the action of cooking becomes non-virtue, right? And Bonker Rinpoche in his what's called the Liberation of the Palm of Your Hand, Lamrim, he gives an example where he says, he gives the example of if somebody was doing prayers to Tara, right? Tara is the goddess of compassion, right? The female Buddhist deity of compassion, active compassion. And oftentimes we Buddhists will do like 21 praises to Tara, right? Praising the 21 aspects of Tara. And he gives this example where he says, if somebody is doing prayers to Tara, but their mind is distracted to something mundane and superficial, then it's not virtue, actually, he says. Doesn't become a virtuous karma even. And then he says, whereas if the person does it with love and compassion and bodhicitta in their heart, then it becomes an amazing virtue. So the point being, again, it's getting back to this thing, it's your mind that creates the karma, right? And he gives this example of doing a prayer, right? Because you could think, oh, if I'm doing a prayer, that has to be a virtuous action, right? But Prabhupada Rinpoche, who was like a great Buddhist master, is saying, no, actually, that's not the definition of good karma. Is your mind in a state of virtue, right? In a state of faith or love or compassion or and so on, wisdom. There are different virtuous states of mind. And can we habituate our minds to those kinds of virtuous mental factors? And the extent to which you habituate your mind to that, then you can create humongous amounts of positive karma, right? Because that's all positive karma is, actually. That's an important point. All positive karma is having your mind in a virtue, as Rinpoche said, right? A good heart, right? He put it very simply. Lama Tsongkhapa, I guess, but that actually is a verse from Lama Tsongkhapa. But, so a good heart means you have a virtuous heart. You have a heart that's, which means a state of mind that's realistic and that's positive, right? And I guess, and actually I was going to, in that same text on mind and mental factors, which they list 11 virtuous mental factors. You can study them if you want to, but there are different, so it's not just those few. I give a few examples, but in essence, right, virtuous mental factors are mental factors that are realistic, that are peaceful, and that recognize our interdependence with others. And the non-virtuous mental factors are agitated, they distort, and they, and they're not as realistic in their understanding of how we're interdependent with others. So again, I want to go back to this quote, right? Jigten Sumgun's quote: karmic cause and effect is the natural manifestation of one's own moment-to-moment thoughts. And thoughts maybe seems too intellectual, but one's moment-to-moment mind, I'll say. What's going on in one's mind, moment-to-moment. That's what karma is. And I just I'll say a few more things, and I'll pause and see if people have questions or comments. But I also want to make a few more points here that I think are relevant. One is, like, if you think about this, actually, it can be disturbing if you recognize it's really easy, isn't it? Like, in other words, it's easy to cultivate. It's easy to, maybe cultivate's the wrong word. It's really easy to have a negative state of mind, isn't it? Like, it's easy to go through hours, right? I mean, with your mind agitated. And if for example, if you get angry about something, right? And that feeling tone of anger can stay for quite a while, can't it? And so that becomes a lot of negative karma then, right? Because everything you do with that feeling tone in your mind, that feeling tone makes it non-virtuous. Right? And sometimes for us normal people, it can be hard to cultivate virtuous states of mind, right? But that's the task, if that makes sense, right? If you're going to guard karma, again, like in I mean, I'm not trying to deny that, on the one hand, it can go backwards for a second. If you have I'm getting at some, I want to get at two different levels here. I'm just trying to keep going back and forth a little bit to these two different levels of karma. If one has a habit of lying, then there's a basic level of Buddhist practice where just going, well, I have this habit of lying. I've got to try to stop that. And you start lying less, or you catch yourself and you stop. That's important. That's good. That's a very basic level of guarding karma, and that's a good thing. So if before one lied daily, and then one comes to a point where one's lying less, and then eventually one, lies much less, that's a really good thing, right? So that's like a basic level of guarding karma. Here, we're getting at a deeper level in a way of guarding karma, which is, it's like, so for example, if you're cultivating loving kindness and compassion in each moment, and that's your practice, right? So you go out throughout the day and you keep trying to cultivate love and compassion. Then what I would say in terms of, like, I use this example of moral development, then it's not going to, then, it'll be quite easy to not lie, right? In other words, that's not a challenge, is it? Because you're working on something that's underlying that, right? There's, because if you have, I guess what they actually get at in Buddhist psychology, the Buddhist teachings on the 10 non-virtues, if you study them in the Abhidharma or in Lamrim, they're always motivated by a non-virtue, if that makes sense. So what Buddhist psychology is saying is, you won't do non-virtuous things if you don't have non-virtuous mental factors in your mind, mental states. So if you don't have craving, so in other words, like, why do we lie, right? We want to get something from somebody. We want them to like us. We want to manipulate their image. We're trying to manipulate something, right? Their image of us, or manipulate their perception. That's egocentric, right? And so what it's getting at is, if you have an egocentric mind to start with, then eventually, and this is actually an underlying teaching in Buddhism, isn't it? Is if you let your mind stay in these non-virtuous states, then you will eventually do negative actions. You can't help it, actually, right? Without control, we'll do them. So in other words, even if you say, oh, I don't want to lie, if you're walking around all day with a kind of, what's the word? Self-centered concern, for example, in your mind, and then eventually you're going to do something like lie, or to try to make yourself look good in some superficial way. It's the nature of that kind of mental state, right, that eventually gives rise to negative actions. I remember once I was like struck by this. Lama Zopa Rinpoche was saying, he was giving an example where he said, he was giving an example of hatred, actually, and he said, you may think, and this is getting at a broader point here, so I'll use this. Lama Zopa Rinpoche, I remember once I was at a Kopan monastery, and he was saying, if you let your mind stay familiar with hatred, right, you're creating negative karma. And then he was making a point. He said, you may think, oh, you're nobody, you're not so important, so what's the difference? But he was making a point. He said, if your mind is filled with hatred, someday, in some lifetime, you'll be a person of great power and influence. And then you'll harm millions of people, through your hatred. Because that's the nature of hatred. Does that make sense? So, like, you may think, oh, I'm just alone cultivating hatred. But actually, when he said that, when I think of that, I often think of that story. The true story, historical moment of, like, I actually sometimes used to think of Hitler sitting alone sitting with a few friends in a bar, being hateful. After World War I, that's what he was doing, right? He was a former soldier in World War I. He was hanging out in bars, drinking, whatever, hanging out with friends in bars, being hateful. And you would think, oh, who cares? He's just some guy in a bar. But my point is, like Lama Zopa was saying, we're him. In other words, if you're cultivating hatred, you're him in the bar, because hatred eventually will lead to evil actions, to horrible things, right? And the opposite is true too, right? Like, why does it matter? Sometimes people will say, like, oh, who cares? Like, so, if you're some Tibetan, whatever, I think it was a Tibetan monk sitting, I think of one of my teachers, Kyuti Senchip Rinpoche. For years and years, he sat alone in a hut in the Himalayas cultivating compassion. And somebody could say, oh, who cares, right? But then, like, the Dalai Lama came and said, oh, please come down and teach the world. He went around the whole planet teaching for years and years, and benefiting many, many people, including myself. right? Like, so what you do in the privacy of your own moment, what you cultivate, impacts the entire world. Does that make sense? That's the Buddhist teaching also on karma. And actually, the Buddhist teaching on karma say karma increases. So little actions lead to big results. Whether they're hatred or whether they're compassion, they eventually lead to big results. Is a simple, direct Buddhist teaching, mainly for you, but also for those around you, of course. Because if you cultivate love, it helps others, and if you cultivate hatred, eventually you'll harm others. So the real core, so this deep Buddhist teaching, I'm going to call it, is what's happening in my mind, moment to moment. And I just want to, I just want to encourage everybody. I guess I've been finding it very helpful. Whatever you're doing, right? Because for this teaching, and one is whatever you do, you're creating karma, right? Does that make sense? Like, according to Buddhism, you can't escape that. There's no escape from that. Because karma is action, right? So by definition, whatever you do, as soon as you're doing, and even if all you're doing is sitting still thinking or laying down thinking, you're still creating karma because your mind is doing. And I said that, right? This mental factor of intention or mental engagement or whatever is omnipresent. It's always there, so we're always creating positive, negative, or neutral karma. So you can't escape that, actually. And what Buddhism is saying also is that so everything you do matters. You see, sometimes, actually, Buddhism says the most evil worldview is nihilism, thinking that what you do doesn't matter. And the reason why that's evil is it's wrong, actually, because you're interdependent with everybody else. And so we all are, and so what we do with our mind in particular has impact. And I don't know, I'm just going on for a minute, but it's okay. Souls Dalai Lama often says, right, world peace begins with inner disarmament. And I want to ask you a question. If you hear the Dalai Lama say that, so the Dalai Lama is saying, world peace, right? World peace is huge, right? That includes Russia and Ukraine and China and United States and Africa and India and the whole planet, right? And so the Dalai Lama is saying that, right, world peace begins with you disarming your own mind, which means overcoming pride and anger and hatred and jealousy and so on in your mind. My question to you is do you believe the Dalai Lama? Or do you think, oh, that's silly? Maybe if you're Buddhist, you don't want to criticize the Dalai Lama, but if you're honest in your own heart, if the Dalai Lama says world peace begins with you personally, working with your mind, do you kind of think, oh, that's just kind of silly, or that's Pollyanna-ish, or world peace is about powerful people somewhere else than my house? I'm just asking, be honest with yourself. What do you think? That's the Dalai Lama's assertion, right? Is world peace begins with you. That's what he always says, right? It begins with the individual disarming their own, he says, changing your own mind. And that's because I'm just pointing out, he has a karmic worldview, right? The Dalai Lama is Buddhist, monk, as he often points out, right? So he has a Buddhist worldview. And a Buddhist worldview is what each person does with their mind is the main factor. Right? And then other things come from that. Because that's the factor that creates karmic, what's the word? And actually, this word, I thought also Lama Tsongkhapa's point, path and ground, right? Lam and Sa, place or something. Your place will be good and your path will be good. What does that mean, actually? It's interesting phrasing Lama Tsongkhapa used. I'll just want to say that too. Because Lama, paths and grounds are what, in one context, that's what the bodhisattvas traverse to become a Buddha, right? They go through the paths and grounds to become a Buddha. But he's using that term, right? It can also mean Lam can also mean the road you walk down. And sa can mean the grounds of a bodhisattva, but can also mean like just that place over there, right? And because it's getting at both, right? In other words, if you really cultivate virtuous states of mind, then you will traverse the paths and the grounds of the great bodhisattvas and become enlightened. But if we don't, right, then we're still going to travel paths and we're still going to be in places, but those places will reflect our karma, right? Which means our mind, actually, our heart. And where we find that where we'll find ourselves is a result of what was in our heart in previous moments. Anyway, so that's a beginning point. That it's like 1 hour. So maybe I'll pause there. Like, I just wanted to emphasize these points, right? So the real way to, they're not the real way, because they're all real ways, but a core way to work with karma, or a deep way to work with karma, is this one, right? Is noting, what are my moment to moment motives? What are my moment, in any given moment and even like check for yourself, right? Like whether you're cooking a meal, is your mind actually in a state of love, or is it distracted to something else? And also, but also if you're doing a practice, right? If you're doing a Buddhist practice, is your mind, how much of the time is your mind in a virtuous state of mind? And how much is it in a negative state of mind, or in a neutral one? And if it's in a neutral one, it's kind of funny, right? You say you're doing Dharma practice, but actually you're not doing, you see what I'm getting at? Like, according to this teaching, which is Lama Tsongkhapa and Jigten Sungam and Gyumi Khyentse Rinpoche, I'm not making it up, right? If you say, oh, I'm doing my Dharma practice, but your mind isn't in a state of virtue, then you're not actually practicing even good karma, much less, a Mahayana practice, for example. There's a comment here. I do believe world peace begins with me. If I'm at peace, then there's a chance I can influence others. Just as if I'm angry, others will be affected negatively. Yep. So that seems to be what the Dalai Lama is saying too, isn't it? So yeah, maybe I'll pause there and I can say there's a lot more to say about karma if we could talk about, but I'll pause there and see, do people have comments or questions? Just don't want to keep going and going without, in case anybody does.
Hi, Lorne. It's Louisa.
Hey, Louisa.
Just, this is not a lesson question, but just a general question. I'm wondering, there was a lot. It was great, and I would like to listen to it again. I'm just wondering how soon it will be posted, so that we can review it. Today.
Somebody has a view on that.
Probably later today.
Okay, great.
Could be later today, just within a couple of hours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chappelle, and thank you very much, Dr. Ladner. Really appreciate it.
And then, Wesley.
Hey, thank you. This been pretty awesome so far. A question that I sort of had, going back to the sort of example that you gave, sort of at the very beginning, kind of like served as a basis for everything regarding the like the different perceptions of, like, you had mentioned like a loud car outside your house, and how you depending on your karma, or your habitual tendencies, you create two different realities out of that almost like one same event. So I guess tying this into, because I've been reading a text on the tenet systems and whatnot. It's by Dr. Daniel Kotzord, and commentary on Jemring Sheva's text. And he sort of explains that this idea of two different realities being imposed on a single pure reality, almost, I guess you could say, is sort of like a Chittamatra view almost. Meanwhile, he explains that contrast to the Prasangika view is that there actually is two separate realities that people with different karma are perceiving. And he uses the example of, I think he says, like a god, a hungry ghost, and a hell being, all perceiving, a river as either nectar, blood, or pus, saying that the Chittamatra view would be that there is just one river there that's being perceived in three different ways. Meanwhile, the Prasangas would be saying that there's actually different things there. So In the former view, the one that you gave, obviously a lot of this, makes sense in terms of how we can, purify our perception and whatnot, through the, through taking into account karma. But I'm having trouble seeing how the latter view can sort of lead towards a sort of, like purification of our experience, being that it kind of seems like, that it doesn't really allow for the elimination of those actual realities. Born through karma.
Say that last part again. I just missed the last. I'm not sure I got the last part of what you were saying there.
Yeah. So it kind of seems like in the former view, when there's, a single, I guess you could say, quote unquote, pure reality, or it's pure reality that you'd access through pure perception. And the second view where, there's actually different realities that are perceived depending on what karma you have. I sort of fail to see how that second view allows for sort of like, a purification of our experience. Because it kind of seems like, not that it's asserted intrinsically that these realities exist, but it kind of seems like these realities will always exist, but, it's whether or not we choose to perceive them.
Interesting. So step back and, yeah, it's a complex question, one thing, but I'll say, sort of a few different points. One is like, one thing that if you think of like all the, obviously there are many different, there are 4 main Buddhist tenet systems, but then there are subsystems, right? Like even within the Majjhimaka, right? There's the Prasangika and the Svatantrika. But one point that all the Buddhist tenet systems would agree on, because some like some Buddhist tenet systems say that right? Well, some, for example, actually, it's interesting, like the Chitta Matran school says, that there's no external reality separate and cut off from the mind, right? Whereas Prasangika say there is an external reality, but it doesn't have any inherent existence, and so on. But anyway, and then Vaibhajikas would say there is like that the external reality is made up of partless particles and so on. So they all have slightly different tenets about that. But one thing they all agree on actually is that how we react in relation to that external reality is up to us. So that's one point that all Buddhist schools would agree with. In other words, is that and so so whether you're like whether a individual practitioner were following any of the various tenet systems, all the tenet systems would agree, for example, that I'll give an example like that like that no external object is, some may say an external object is independent, it exists independently of mind, and others would say it only exists in the nature of mind, and others would say it exists merely labeled by the mind or something. So they have slightly different tenets in that, but they would all agree actually that there is no external object that's intrinsically aversive or intrinsically in the nature of producing anger, versus producing love. They would all say that how we, what's the word to say, right? Yeah, that how we react to an external object can change, and that we can change that reaction, and that's where so yeah, and all Buddhist schools would agree on that. That's one point. And then I guess another point is, you're correct that in that traditional example of like a water, and there's a that could be perceived differently by beings in different realms. What I'll make is like, that's clearly true, isn't it? Or even we could, they give the example of gods and hungry ghosts and humans. But even in everyday life, we can see that, can't we? Like, actually, I'll give a very simplistic, I often think, there are many examples, but I'll give a very simplistic one. Like, You know, if somebody grew up with a, so I'm going to use all examples of humans for a second. Like, if I grew up, you know, I grew up not being allergic to peanuts, for example, but then if somebody else grew up with a horrible peanut allergy, and we both saw peanut butter, like I might look at peanut butter and immediately think, oh, wow, I can have some for lunch. That'd be great. And the other person who grew up with a peanut allergy from childhood might look at that and immediately feel nauseated, right? So there's nothing intrinsic. My point is like whether, you know, however you interpret the, you know, I'm just using that as an example, that all Buddhist schools would agree that that's true, right? That things can appear differently to different people depending upon causes and conditions and circumstances. And that we can change, you know, our own habitual tendencies and how we perceive any given object is true according to all Buddhist schools. You know, and the last part of I think what you were getting at though is like, so is there something there, right? One way, and I'm going to put it in different terms. Is there something there from the side of the object, you know, that makes it what it is? And what I would say is that really is different according to different Buddhist tenet systems. But and in brief, I'll just say, I mean, so the mind-only school would say, right, because you were saying the Chitta Mantra, the mind-only school would say that things exist, that things don't exist independent and cut off from the mind, actually, right? So they would say each of us has their own appearance, whereas the Prasangika school actually just would say, you know, it's dependent arising, but has no intrinsic nature. So it has nothing. There's nothing intrinsic coming from the side of the object. But going back, does that fully answer your question, or is there a part missed?
Yeah, I mean, like it mostly answers in, like, you know, I guess like sort of like that last the very last statement that you gave, in terms of like, because that makes sense in terms of, you know, if and like, you know, you mentioned about like the peanut allergy and whatnot, that makes sense if mind has primacy over, you know, the world and phenomena, I guess you could say. But when our sort of reactions to things and whatnot aren't purely based on mind, but they're also dependent on the phenomena itself, then it almost seems like, you know, it almost seems like that it's not just cultivating the mind that will lead to a pure perception. It's also the phenomena also plays a role itself. And that's sort of what I guess confuses me as to how this sort of purification can take place if the phenomena is playing a role.
Well, that's I guess. Well, that's fair, and different. And again, different Buddhist tenet systems do have different stances on that. But I will say, like I guess I'll say it this way: all the Mahayana Buddhist tenet systems, so the mind only and the Madhyamaka, really do say mind is primary. So going to what you said, that they would all say mind is actually the primary, and that yeah, that's clear. So mind is the primary factor.
Oh, okay. Okay, that's that clears a lot up. All right, yeah. All right, yeah, thank you. That was great.
Okay. And then Ron has hand up.
Yes. So we're familiar with the statement that our worst enemy is our best friend in our spiritual development. So when you were talking about the impulse of the mind, and to use your example of the person revving their engine outside of your window, so if the first impulse is an anger impulse, but then you catch yourself and you say, oh, wait a second, I'm getting angry. I shouldn't be angry. and you start developing love towards that person, understanding that person, trying to say, well, maybe that person has got, his car is not working, and it's a nurse trying to get to the hospital to her shift, a mother trying to take her kids to school, or even if it's some kind of a person that it's doesn't care for anyone, and then you send, like the meditation we were doing at the before the lecture, you send your love, compassion to that person, trying to help him not to be not caring about anybody else, but to become a caring person. So the question is, so if somebody has anger impulse as the first impulse of the mind from such an event of the revving car, but then he holds himself back and is trying to correct it. So what was that? Was that negative karma? Was that positive karma? Definitely was cultivating spiritual development, but in as far as karma is concerned, what was that?
Yeah, first of all, so first thing is, yeah, obviously, first of all, you're absolutely right. That's Dharma, that's good practice of the Buddhist practice. And then though, going back to your point actually about what karma is, that it's an interesting question, right? Because if karma is each moment, you know, then you could say that first, like, so the first moment where the mind engaged with anger, I mean, you could say it's not a, you would say it's, I mean, by definition, it's a negative karma, that moment, but it's not a complete karma. In other words, you didn't, they're all kind of, we'll go through that if you want, if there's time, we can go through it, but there are qualities, certain things that have to be present for something to be a complete karma versus a incomplete karmic action. So the first moment where one engaged with anger would be a moment of anger. So that would be a negative karmic moment. But actually, if you, in your example, right, then the person is sort of doing, contemplating, right, and thinking, oh, this person could be like that, or it could be like this, and let me cultivate compassion for them, and let me cultivate love for them, and so on. So all of those moments would be positive karma, right? So in other words, in your example, the example you gave, there would actually be, there would be, you know, the one moment would be a negative karmic, incomplete, I would call that an incomplete action of karma. And then there will be many moments of positive karma. And actually, if you did the practice you described, where you cultivated, the person then cultivated a whole sense of like compassion for that person, then you could actually say that would be a complete and quite a powerful positive karma. So in that case, there would be, but you can't, actually, it's interesting, isn't it? From
With the positive nullify, with the extended positive nullify the short negative. Would there be a nullification there, or the first impulse of anger still stands, or the other one nullifies that momentary lapse?
I think from my understanding of the Buddhist teachings on karma, both would stand. So in other words, there would be more positive karma than negative because you did more time, you know, and more effort into the positive karma, but both would stand until the person did a purification. You know, and the purification would be, it was mentioned, it doesn't have to be some formal, you know, that we do sometimes like Vajrasattva or other purification practices. But actually, it's interesting. I'll say, let's go through it. You can answer the question, then I'll say a point, and then you see what you think. Because the most essential part of purification is regret, right? So, you know, is intelligent regret. I sometimes say there are 4 powers of purification, right? Intelligent regret, refuge and bodhicitta, then an actual antidote practice, something to, and then committing not to doing it again. So actually, it depends in a way, right? Like, in other words, if the person, let's say if I use, I'm imagining, I wake up and I feel angry for a moment, and then I meditate on compassion. If I just sort of had that moment of anger and then thought, oh, wait, I'm Buddhist, I want to practice Dharma, let me do this, then there'd be a moment of anger, which was a negative karma, and then there'd be a bunch of practice that would be a positive karma. On the other hand, if in there I actually had a feeling of regret, for that moment of anger, thinking, oh, that's going to cause suffering to myself and others, and then I did the other practice thinking, let me counteract that, and let me try not to do that again, then I would have purified it. So it depends upon the mind, if that makes sense. If you did the 4 powers, even, you could do them formally in some kind of ritual, but that the ritual isn't what matters really. If you did them psychologically in your own mind as you were sort of going through, oh, wow, I don't want to be, so if part of your practice were thinking, oh, I got angry at my neighbor, but I don't want to be angry at my neighbor, that's creating negative karma, and it's creating a bad karmic relationship with that person that will lead to suffering for me and suffering for them and so on. And you generated that kind of intelligent regret, and then you thought, I'm cultivating love to reverse that. So I'm going to cultivate love for them to reverse that tendency and purify that karma, then it would be purified. So it depends upon which way you go about your practice, I think.
So since you say that you'll ask me the question, and what answer do I have?
Yeah.
So, of course, naturally, and I guess everyone would have the tendency to say, of course, if I go through the process of purification, even at that instance, in time, close to the, as the event takes place, as the event evolves, I regret it. I do all the 4 stages of purification, and then I nullify that momentary, small, short in time lapse of anger. But that might be true. But I think I would like not to believe it, but I would like not to use it. Why? Because then I'm not I'm not so developed that I cannot fall into that trap of saying, oh, I just was angry, but let me purify, etc. Okay, and I nullify. I rather believe that I cannot nullify it. So I don't fall into the trap in the future of saying, oh, I was angry for a couple of minutes, but that's okay. I'm sending love. I'm going through the purifying process. So that few moments of anger don't count. They were canceled. So I'd rather not believe in that, but believe that they will count, although not in as much power as my good karma mind. But you understand why? Because I don't want to fall in the trap that in the future I say, oh, that's okay, I purify, I cancel it. Because then I'll keep going and going and going and having all these small moments of bad karma and think that I can just cancel them by purifying or having good karma following it. You understand my thinking?
Yeah, I get it. Yeah, interesting. Huh. Yeah, interesting point. And I think I one last comment I'll make is I also think I was just reflecting on what you were saying, and I think actually it's funny. One thing I actually think that the way you were thinking about it, actually ironically, so if you're thinking, oh, I don't want to purify because I so want to avoid that. Actually, I think that's a better purification, actually, in a way.
No,
it's funny.
I do want to purify. I do want to purify. I will purify, but I will not think that the purification nullify that bad karma. I want to purify because all those little karmas adding up can add up to a lot of bad karma. I will purify, but I won't think that the purification nullify that bad karma. I would think that at the end of the day, when the good karma is compared to the bad karma, those little bad karmas are going to be there on that side of the scale as much as I be purified. I will purify for the sake of my spiritual development, but I won't purify to think that, oh, I got rid of it, I nullify it, because then it will be easier for me to have that impulse again in the future and say, oh, okay, I'm going to purify it and I'm going to erase it. So that's why I don't want to do it. But I will purify it, but not for the sake of erasing it, but for the sake of my development.
I think it's a beautiful way to think, actually. I think that's beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, and then there are a couple in the chat. I just don't want to neglect that too. You wrote, let's see. Many of our actions are self-serving. This then means we often are promoting subtle or big negative karma. We need to have great purifications then. Yeah, and that's right. Yeah, and that's at that point. Oh, I can't see the names. Oh, that Karen made is correct, I think, and and that's where there's that famous many verses actually in Buddhism, but that say like the self-centered attitude is the cause of all suffering. Love and cherishing others is the cause of all happiness. And so that's right. In other words, what that's getting at is similar to what we were saying here, actually, in the sense that there's certain Mahayana Buddhists, there are many different verses that all get at the same point, but what they're actually saying is what this is saying, right? Which is that, if we have that kind of self-serving or self-centered, I'll call it self-centered attitude, that is connected to the mental afflictions, actually, right? And tends to give rise to suffering and to negative karma. That's right. And that the mind cherishing others, which is a mind of love and compassion, underlies, creating good karma. So it's another way of measuring, actually, how our mind, do we have the good heart? Do we have the good mind? Is if we have love, compassion, and bodhicitta, then for sure, our path will be good and very good, and our future will be very good. Our ground, our places will be good, and so on. So that's right. That's a good way to measure, right? Is the self-serving or self-centered attitude present or not? It's a good way to measure where we're at in any given moment. And then it says, are we changing perceptions or relationship to? Maybe I'll make one quick comment about this too, and then if there's more to that, we can address it too. But I'll make one quick comment. One thing we have to also differentiate, and I just want to mention it because sometimes people, nobody said anything here, but sometimes people raise this as a question. Is we also have to differentiate between a karmic result and a new karma. Does that make sense? And I want to say what I mean by that is actually another of the omnipresent mental factors that's always there is feeling, and feelings can be pleasant, unpleasant, or painful, what you could say, and neutral. And so one point I want to make is it's an interesting distinction. When you experience a pleasant sensation or a painful sensation, let's say, I'll use those two as an example, which are the mental factor of feeling, those are a result of past karma. Does that make sense? So those arise, according to Buddhism, when we feel, I'll give you an example, when we feel an unpleasant sensation, like pain or discomfort or something, that's a karmic result. So that's not, in other words, that's not a new cause. And by nature, that's not virtuous or non-virtuous. That's not a virtue. So for example, if somebody's feeling some kind of mental or physical pain, right? That's just a result of our past, of something in the past, of causes and conditions from the past. And so that aspect of how we perceive something, so in other words, if I perceive a certain thing as painful, I don't have the power in the present to erase that, because that's a karmic result. What we have the power in the present to do is to cultivate, is to do things to cultivate, what's the word? Virtuous or non-virtuous reactions to that, if that makes sense. So in other words, so in my example earlier, if I, I could come up with countless examples, but the point is so, if I experience a moment of pain in the present, right, or discomfort, so that experience of pain or discomfort is a result of past actions. In the present, I can use that, let's say, painful moment to cultivate anger, saying, oh, it's somebody else's fault, in which case I'm then creating more negative karma, right? or I can use that experience of pain to cultivate, for example, empathy, right? For others, so I can think, oh, wow, I'm experiencing this pain. Others also have pain like this, and then I can use that to cultivate compassion. Then the pain becomes a cause, so that painful experience becomes how that painful experience becomes part of a process of creating virtuous karma for the future. So I'm just differentiating here the karmic result, right, which is a kind of an experience manifesting in the present, from what we're doing with our mind in the present, which is creating our path and ground into the future. So, if we're experiencing something unpleasant or painful in the present, that, I guess, actually, there's often that we just have to, in a way, we have to bear that, right? And ideally, we want to bear it with a sense of, as Ron was giving an example of, to bear it with while cultivating virtue, actually, right? Well, cultivating something good in the present, and then it becomes possible. Actually, I've often thought about this. That then it becomes possible, where you can have, because actually the truth is that we're all going to have pleasant and unpleasant experiences. If you have a human body, good things are going to happen and bad things are going to happen, but there's no way actually to be human and not have painful experiences, is there? It's going to happen sometimes. We're going to get sick, we're going to have bad things happen in the environment and so on. Some Buddhist teachers, I noticed Tibetan teachers don't use this word. I'm not sure. I haven't heard a Buddhist Tibetan monk use this word, but I'll use the word resilience for a second. Actually, even though they don't use that word, I've often reflected that, some of the Tibetan lamas I've known are the most resilient people I've ever met. And part of that is because they train themselves to meet painful current moment experiences with cultivating mental strength, right? With cultivating qualities like wisdom or compassion or loving kindness or spiritual resolve towards liberation and so on. So when negative circumstances arise, rather than getting discouraged or hopeless or hateful or they call, actually, I was I think it's okay to share this because it's not going to give any details, but I remember recently I was talking to somebody who was having a painful experience, and they were saying, oh, I hope I don't become hateful because of this. And I was like, that was an interesting reflection, that people sometimes do that. And one thing that the Tibetan Buddhist teachings really emphasize is this idea of meeting painful experiences with mental training, right? Which is a form of resilience, and which makes them meaningful, and which allows sometimes a painful experience to continue because they don't always go away very quickly. What's the word? With a sense of meaning and with a sense of purpose, and even with a kind of mental happiness that can come. Anyway, so that's one point I just wanted to make, is there's a difference between the karmic result and, not to blame ourselves for the karmic results, but to use them to cultivate something useful, something constructive is the idea. Any other comments or questions? Or I'll say just one more point maybe or something. Let's make another point. Which I think is worth, there are again, as I said at the beginning, there are like countless things that can be said about karma. But I'll just say one more thing about karma among the many that could be said. And that is this, they often talk about 4 types of karmic effects. And I think that's maybe worth sharing just because it's worth contemplating. And so, when you do a complete karmic action, right, where you have, a complete karmic action, which we can go through some other time, like all the factors that are there. But a complete karmic action can be virtuous or non-virtuous depending on which kind of mental effect, right? Again, in my examples from earlier, right? If you have hatred in your mind and you do a complete karmic action, that's definitely a negative karma. If you have loving kindness in your mind and you do a complete karmic action, that's positive karma. And either of those will lead to they say 4 types of karmic effects. One is the fully ripened effect, or the fruitional result, they sometimes call it, which is a rebirth. So there is that someday, some lifetime, when you die, that will throw you into a whole new life. And if it's a virtuous karma, it will throw you into a life in a higher realm, like the human realm or a divine realm. If it's a negative karma, it will throw you into a whole life in 1 of the 3 lower realms. That's what the first of the 4 results. The second one is they call it sometimes, and well, the second one has two parts to it. One is effects that conform to the cause. And there are 2 types of that. One is like, so in other words, that I'm going to give a simple example of a negative karma that they often give. If you're violent, if your karmic cause was violence, then whether you're in a lower realm or if you're eventually human again, the karmic result of violence is that you'll be in a violent environment, right? An environment that has violence in it. And the positive example, if you're generous, then you'll find yourself in an abundant environment. So that's one type of effect that conforms with the cause. It correlates to the cause in a way. And then the other kind of effect that conforms or correlates to the cause is probably, actually, I remember once Lama Zohar, she said, this is the most important one, is you'll have a tendency to do it again. That whatever you habituate yourself to, you'll tend to do more of. And I just want to say, I think that's the most important of all the karmic results. Lama Zohar, she said that, and as I think about it over the years, I'm more and more convinced that's true. Because that's, Lama Zohar, she said, that's the one that makes samsara endless, actually. Right. In other words, if you get habituated to negative actions and you just keep doing them, samsara will never end, actually. So we have to stop. That's the one where if you think about it, you go, oh my goodness, you have to stop. It's bad enough that you'll suffer some external, lifetime or some, environmental factors and so on. But to keep doing a negative thing over and over seems unbearable, actually, doesn't it? And then the 4th type of karmic result are what they call environmental. I'm sorry, I got them mixed up. I got the order mixed up. So there's the fully ripened, which is the rebirth. There's the tendency to do it again, which I mentioned. There are environmental results. That's the environmental one. And then there's personal results, the other kind of effect. So the environment, my example of a violent environment would be the environmental effect. Then the other one that's affecting conformity with the cause would be personal experiences that correlate to the cause. And that the example there is like, so if you killed somebody, you tend to have a short life. If you were generous to somebody, you receive gifts. So the one is environmental, like the place you're in, but the other is your personal experiences. And so all of those, point being that all of those, what I'm getting at here, and the reason why I just thought to share this before we stop is, what this is getting at is that each karmic action we do can give rise to many results. Does that make sense? And again, so I'm just emphasizing this before we stop. So again, what's the emphasis there? That what you do, it's weird actually, if you think about it, like that what you do matters, in a way it matters infinite. That's what it's saying, right? Like, and that if you, because you'll do it again, right? And again and again. And you're interrelated, you're interdependent with and interrelated with others infinitely, right? In Buddhism, we say everybody's been your mother in past lives, right? Point being that we're infinitely interconnected with other beings. And so whatever karmic tendencies and habits we cultivate will have infinite impacts on ourselves and others, won't they? Because you tend to do it again. So in other words, it's weird, isn't it? Like, so if on the negative, I'll just give one negative and one positive example, right? So like if you steal something today, right, you cause somebody else suffering, right? It will lead to a lower rebirth for oneself, for yourself, right? in future lives, like you'll have things stolen, right? And you'll tend to steal again, which again will create suffering for others, right? And again will lead to suffering experiences for you. And it goes on and on and on. That's what samsara is, in part, at least, right? Samsara is also taking rebirth through the power of karma and mental afflictions, but that's this, actually, right? The karma, this is the karma part of, and actually the mental afflictions are there too, right? So if out of greed, you steal from somebody, right? Then that motivation of greed gives rise to a karmic action, which then gives rise to all kinds of suffering results, a rebirth, and having things stolen, and living in an environment where there's not much resources and not many opportunities. And it leads to this tendency to steal again, which again will lead to all those results. And the good news here, right, is if you cultivate a positive karma, right? And my example is the opposite one. So generosity, right? That will lead to a good rebirth, right? In a positive realm, it will lead to positive experiences of receiving and being around, opportunities. But the most important one is it will lead to a habit of giving again. And there's one teaching I thought was interesting. It said if you cultivate generosity, actually I thought it was an interesting teaching, and so I'll just share it. It said if you cultivate this attitude of generosity, then eventually you'll come across, in some, because you'll tend to give again and again, eventually you'll come across an Arya Bodhisattva, and you'll give to them. And then that will be very important, because then they'll teach you, you'll interrelate with them, you'll create karma with them.
Say that again.
So sorry, oh, you couldn't hear, sorry. I was saying that teaching was saying if you cultivate generosity, I think Chandrakirti said this in the Majjhimaka Avatara, actually, the supplements middle way. He said, if you cultivate the tendency to be generous, that in of itself will lead to good results, right? It leads to good rebirth, it leads to positive rebirths, it leads to abundance and having resources and so on. But then he said, one of the most important things about cultivating generosity is someday you'll come across a bodhisattva who's seen emptiness directly, or a Buddha. And because you've habituated yourself to generosity, you'll give them, and you'll create a karmic relationship with them. And then he says, and then eventually, because you have relationships with them, they'll teach you the view of emptiness, and they'll teach you the path of bodhicitta, and then you'll become a Buddha because of that, And so I'm just making a point of like how big the effects are. Does that make sense? That all that comes from starting to cultivate a habit of generosity.
So where does Chandrakirti say that, in a particular text? Or that's very awesome understanding. Where does he write that?
He writes that actually it's in the Majjhimaka Avatara, his text, the Majjhimaka Avatara. And he has a chapter on generosity. Actually, it's in that chapter on the perfection of. It's a chapter on the perfection of generosity, in which he also discusses the first bhumi, actually, because that's where you perfect it. You become especially skilled in the practice of generosity. So, yeah, it's in the Majjhimaka Avatara in the chapter on generosity where he says that.
I wanted to add that even though we all know in abstractly about the rebirth and the karma that comes to fruition in future rebirths, but I learned that karma can actually come to fruition in one's own life. An action in a present life can come not immediately, but later on come to fruition in the same life. So I don't think people pay attention to that much, because then it would actually, the message would come across how important one's actions are when they realize that's not going to be in some future rebirth, but in this lifetime.
That's right. Yeah, and what they say actually on that, I think you probably already know this, but what they say is that that's especially true of very powerful karma. Like, so they give many examples. If you create, like, if somebody creates very powerful negative karma, then it can lead to, then it can ripen in this life, or positive karma. So, so if you cultivate like a great deal of powerful karma, then it can that's more even likely to take rebirth. I'm sorry, not take rebirth, to take effect, to bring an effect in the same lifetime as well. That's true. But any other comments or questions? But well, I'll just conclude. Well, we'll do dedication in a second. I just want to say, so I hope, you'll probably have studied karma quite a bit, but I hope those, especially that, I guess I'll just say I've been finding it very useful to, like, especially to make our what would ordinarily be a neutral karma positive. Does that make sense? Like, by cultivating these positive states of mind. So I would just challenge you to think about that. Like, can you make taking a walk or driving to work or cooking lunch or making a phone call, whatever, or the everyday activities that you spend many hours oftentimes in a week doing, to challenge yourself to experiment with that. Like, going back to Ken Rinpoche's point, right? Can I cultivate samsangpo, good heart, right? Meaning like love or compassion or bodhicitta or something like that, and actually to check, can I do that while making a phone call? Can I do that? I mean, you can, but how adept can I? How am I at it? In theory, it's possible for anybody. That doesn't mean we ourselves could do it at any given moment very well, but we'll get better at it if we try. Does that make sense? And that's how bodhisattvas train, actually. Is Ken Rinpoche also made that point. He said, he said at first bodhicitta for everybody, actually, at first bodhicitta is kind of artificial. All bodhisattvas started with a kind of artificial version of bodhicitta, that's made up where you give rise to it. It's kind of weak and it's sort of, only with a lot of effort, and it doesn't feel very heartfelt. And he made the point that's how all bodhisattvas started. And then it became a little more familiar, and then a little more familiar. And someday it became totally spontaneous. And then it became like even in their dreams. And then it became, even in their sleep, and even in their sneezing, and even in their whatever, everything. So can you make going to the restroom imbued with love and compassion? Can you make, driving to the store imbued with love and compassion? I'm just challenging you. That's what this teaching is about, really, isn't it? Is, then your path will be good, your ground will be good, as Ken Rinpoche and the Dalai Lama said. So anyway, I'm just encouraging everybody to experiment with that for yourself and see what you notice in your own experience. What's that like to try to do that? And what the Lamas pointed out in many teachings is, if you do that, actually, if you have some success in practicing that, you'll immediately, yes, it'll lead to good karmic results for future lives and so on. But going to Ron's last point, it will make you happy now. That's what they actually said. Lama Zopa said, the moment you start to cherish others in your heart, become joyful. So actually, if you get good at that, then you'll also have incredible joy right away. Actually, you don't have to wait for the joyful part, because that's what makes the mind happy, actually, is love and compassion, these states of mind. So anyway, so I think if we practice that, it's a way of creating not only good karma for the future, but also of having a joyful life in the present. And I guess we should stop there with dedication. So what hopefully
Lorne, can I just Chopel, if I can have just after everybody checks out and we close the recording, I just want to have like a couple of moments to tell you something personal. Is that okay?
Okay.
After we're all done, is that, can you do that? Can we?
Yeah,
do
I can just leave it open, or I can make like a breakout meeting room or something. We'll figure it out.
Yeah, you can stop the recording. Everybody checks out except me and Lorne. I just wanted to tell him something personal. Okay.
Sure.
All right, all right, thanks.
Okay. And then so as I was saying, so we created, hopefully we created good karma together. And so one thing, and obviously in Buddhist practice, many of you know this, but is you dedicate, right, the virtue of good karma to a result. You have something like some say the good karma is like a energy or a substance, and we'll dedicate it. So the supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chinrezik Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. And also we can dedicate it to the long life of Gyume Khyentse Rinpoche and Geshe Darge, who often teach, teachers connected to DNKL. May their lives be long, and may all their compassionate wishes come to fulfillment. And then, we can also dedicate it, right? So may all of us, all the people who came to class in particular, may all of us succeed in cultivating bodhicitta, love and compassion and bodhicitta, cultivating wisdom, and so that we can traverse the paths and the grounds of the bodhisattvas, and thereby be of ultimate benefit to others. And then last, we can remember that the merits themselves are empty of inherent existence and therefore function in a causal relationship, right? So good karma functions because it's empty of some kind of static intrinsic nature. It exists relationally. So recognizing that because karma is empty of that kind of some kind of independent status, it exists dependently, right, and relationally. So may that kind of karma, which exists as dependent arising, through that kind of karma, right? May the I, which exists similarly, right, is dependent arising, totally empty from its own side, achieve the Buddha's enlightenment, which is also exists as dependent arising, is merely labeled totally empty from its own side. So right, so may the I transform into the state of a Buddha. And since I am not intrinsic, each of us are not intrinsically existent, right, then it becomes possible that we can transform, become Buddhas. So through these virtuous merits, may we all transform in that way and become Buddhas, and lead all sentient beings who also exist in that way to Buddhahood. Because they're empty, they can become Buddhas. So may we lead them to Buddhahood. Well, thanks very much.
Lorne,
Thank you
thank
very
so
much.
Thank you,
Lorne.
Lorne. Thank you.
Good to connect. Always
Thank
good to
you,
connect
Lorne.
with the DNKL community. It's a great
Yeah, we
community.
really appreciate it, Lorne. Have a good rest of the day.
Oh, thanks. You too.
Thank you, Lorne.